Welcome to the Sleeping Almanac. Tonight, the strangest thing the gods of Asgard ever did. The day they dressed Thor, the strongest god in the worlds, the storm god, the wielder of the great hammer Mjolnir. They dressed him as a bride. They put a veil on his face, a gown on his shoulders, the bride's keys at his belt, and the great gold necklace of Freyja, the goddess of love, at his throat. And they rode him east, in his own goat chariot, to a giant's wedding feast, in the cold country across the world, where the hammer that had been stolen from him 8 nights before was waiting on a pillow. We will tell the story tonight from the Þrymskviða, the Lay of Þrymr, the last and strangest of the great Thor poems, preserved in the Codex Regius. There is a verse in the Havamal, the wisdom poem of the Old North, that says, "Praise the day at evening, praise the woman after she is buried, praise the weapon when it has been tried. Tonight, by the time the story is done, Mjolnir will be tried. Settle in, let your shoulders drop." We begin on the morning the hammer disappeared. Chapter 1. The Empty Pillow. Thor woke at dawn. The Þrymskviða does not tell us exactly what dawn it was, or what season of the year. We can imagine, from the small details the poem gives us, that it was an early summer dawn, that the long gray light of the eastern sky was already pale, that the goats in the yard outside Thor's hall were already stirring, that the small birds of Asgard were beginning their first careful calls in the trees of Viking. We can imagine that Thor's wife Sif, the one with hair of gold, was still asleep beside him. We can imagine the slow, steady rhythm of her breathing in the early light. We can imagine that the hall around them was very still. Thor opened his eyes. He reached, the way he always reached on waking, to his right side, to the place on the floor beside his bed where he kept Mjolnir, the hammer that the dwarves Eitri and Brokkr had forged for him in the great forging contest of long ago, the hammer that had cracked the heads of giants, the hammer that had broken the rocks of the world rim, the hammer that had been at his side every night since the day it had been given to him. His hand closed on nothing. The floor was empty. There was no haft. There was no head. There was no leather thong. There was no oilcloth wrapped around the great iron weight. There was only the dust of the floor and the cold morning air against his palm. Thor sat up. He sat up very slowly. The Þrymskviða gives us this moment, with its rare gift for the quiet detail. The poem tells us that Thor, who had killed more giants than any other being in the worlds, Thor the strongest of the gods, Thor who had pulled the world serpent up out of the deep, Thor in this moment did not roar, did not curse, did not strike out. The poem says only that he sat up, and that he looked at the floor, and that his beard shook. His beard shook. That is the line the Þrymskviða gives us. In the old language, the line is Skeg nam at Hrista, skor nam at Dija. His beard began to shake. His hair began to tremble. Not because he was afraid. Thor did not get afraid. The trembling, the Old North understood, was the small physical sign of the anger that was beginning, very slowly, in the center of Thor's chest, like a small fire being lit, somewhere deep, that would burn slowly outward, and that, if it was not contained, would burn the whole world. Thor's beard shook. He stood up. He did not wake Sif. He moved very quietly, the poem tells us, around the bed, looking on every side. He looked under the bed. He looked behind the wall hangings. He looked in the corners of the room. He looked in the small chests of his clothes. He looked in the high rafters above the bed. He looked everywhere a hammer might have been mislaid by a tired man at the end of a long day. He did this very thoroughly, very slowly, very carefully, even though he knew, and the poem implies that he knew, that Mjolnir was not in the room. Mjolnir, the poem implies, was not in the hall at all. Mjolnir, the poem implies, was not in Asgard. Mjolnir was somewhere else. Thor finished his search. He stood for a long moment in the center of his own bedroom, in the dim gray early morning light, with the chest still open behind him, and the wall hanging still pulled aside, and he looked at the place beside the bed where his hammer had always been. The dust on the floor was undisturbed. That was the strange thing. That was the thing the Þrymskviða does not say, but implies. The dust on the floor was undisturbed. There was no scuff mark of a thief's foot. There was no print of a hand. There was no track of a sliding object. The hammer had not been pulled away. The hammer had not been dragged. The hammer had not been picked up by hands that had crossed the room from any door. The hammer had simply, sometime in the night, ceased to be where it had been. That was a kind of theft, Thor understood, that very few beings in the world could perform. That was the theft of a being who could reach into a god's bedroom from somewhere else and take a hammer out of its place and leave the dust undisturbed. Thor knew in that moment that he had a problem. He went to find Loki. He did not wake Sif. He did not call for his servants. He did not yet, the poem implies, tell anyone in his own hall what had happened. He walked out the door of his bedroom, down the long hall of his house, across the small dawn courtyard outside his hall, where the goats were beginning to bleat for their morning feed, and across the long open road that led between the gods' halls in Asgard. And he went directly to the door of the only being in the worlds who would know what to do. Loki. Loki, who had been there at the forging of the hammer. Loki, who had been there at every clever thing the gods had ever done. Loki, who, when a thing was lost, was the only being in Asgard who would think to ask the right questions about who might have taken it. Loki, who in his own way, even though Loki was the one who would eventually be the cause of the ending of all things, Loki was also, in the long old north, the one being who could be relied on to find a thing that had gone missing. Thor arrived at Loki's door. He did not knock. He pushed the door open and walked into Loki's hall. Loki was already awake. Loki, the poem implies, with the small smile of a poet who knows his characters. Loki was already awake, because Loki was always already awake. Loki slept lightly. Loki kept odd hours. Loki, in the dawn, was usually already sitting somewhere with a cup of something warm in his hands, watching the morning come on. He had eyes the color of cold water. He had a thin face. He had a small smile that did not quite reach his eyes. Loki looked up when Thor came in. He saw Thor's beard still shaking. He set down his cup very carefully, and he stood up. He said, "What has happened?" Thor said, "My hammer is gone. The Þrymskviða gives us, in this moment, one of its small jewels. Loki, who could be many things, and who was many things, and who would in the end be the betrayer of all things. Loki, in this single moment, was Thor's friend. The poem records no laughter, no quick remark, no quip. The poem records only that Loki, hearing what Thor had to say, understood immediately. Loki said, "Come with me." And the two of them, the god of thunder, with his beard still trembling, and the trickster of Asgard, with his cold eyes very calm and very focused, the two of them walked out of Loki's hall together and across the dawn road and toward the hall of Freyja. Because Loki, the poem implies, had already begun to work the problem, and Loki, the poem implies, knew exactly what the first move had to be. Chapter 2. The Borrowed Wings. Freyja was awake. The poem does not tell us how she knew the two gods were coming. We can imagine, in the way the Old North imagined these things, that Freyja, who was the goddess of love and of fertility and of war and of magic, who was a Vanir goddess older than the Aesir, who saw a great many things that other gods did not see, that Freyja had simply, on some morning instinct, felt that two of her colleagues were on their way to her door. She was at the threshold of her hall when they arrived. The Þrymskviða describes her in a single image, and the image is the small precious detail of this part of the poem. She is, the poem says, wearing the great necklace, Brísingamen, the necklace of fire, a necklace whose origin the Þrymskviða does not tell us, though later tellings, in other later poems, would give the necklace a long strange story of its own. The Þrymskviða tells us only that the necklace was Freyja's, that she wore it every day, that it was the most beautiful object in any of the worlds. Around her throat, the 4 small dwarf stones of it catching the dawn light, her hair fell loose. Her gown was the color of wheat grain just before harvest. She looked at Thor. She looked at Loki. She said, "What is wrong?" Loki spoke. Thor, the poem implies, was not yet capable of words. Thor was still in the small, slow-burning rage of a god who had lost his hammer. Loki spoke for him. Loki said, "Freyja, lend us your feather cloak." The poem moves quickly here, and we will move with it, but let us first explain the cloak, because the cloak is the thing this whole chapter turns on. Freyja owned a great feather cloak. The poem calls it a fjederhammer, a feather skin, but the meaning is more specific than that. The cloak was a falcon skin, a magical garment that, when a being wrapped it around themselves, allowed that being to take the form of a falcon and to fly. Freyja used it for her own purposes. She lent it occasionally to other gods. It was one of the great treasures of Asgard. It was not a thing she gave lightly. Freyja looked at Loki. She said, "Why?" Loki said, "Thor's hammer is gone." Freyja's face changed. The poem does not describe the change in detail. The poem says only, in a single fine line that the Old Norse poets loved, Freyja, hearing what Loki had said, understood at once. She understood what it meant for Mjolnir to be gone. She understood that some giant somewhere had reached into Asgard in the night and pulled the hammer out of the place where it lived. She understood that without Mjolnir, the gods were vulnerable. She understood that without Mjolnir, the giants might come. She said, "Take it." She turned. She went into her hall. She came back out a moment later with the cloak folded over her arms. The cloak was the color of a wild falcon's back, brown and white and gray, with the long banded feathers of the wing folded carefully one over the other. She held it out to Loki. She said, "Bring my cloak back to me, and bring Thor's hammer back to him." Loki took the cloak. Loki bowed to Freyja, very quickly and very formally, in the way the Old Norse tricksters bowed when they wanted to acknowledge that someone had done them a service. Loki turned to Thor. Loki said, "Wait here." The Þrymskviða gives this moment one of its precious small touches. Loki, the poem implies, did not waste any further words. Loki, the poem implies, knew that every moment was a moment in which Mjolnir was somewhere it should not have been. Loki turned and walked out of Freyja's hall, and went to the open space of Idavollr, the great plain at the center of Asgard. And he stood there in the morning light, with the feather cloak in his hands, and he looked east. He looked east, because east was where the Jotnar lived. He looked east, because if Mjolnir had been taken, the being who had taken it would have hidden it in the country of the Jotnar. He looked east, because he was about to fly there. Loki, the poem tells us, swung the feather cloak around his shoulders. The cloak, the way the cloak worked, the way the Old North imagined these things, closed itself around him. The feather settled against his shoulders. The hood came up and over his head. And then, in a way the poem does not bother to describe, because the listener would have known, Loki was no longer Loki. Loki was a falcon. A small gray and brown falcon, with cold eyes and a sharp beak, standing on the long grass of Idavollr in the early morning light, looking east. The falcon opened its wings. The falcon launched into the sky. The Þrymskviða describes this, and this is one of the small lovely lines of the poem. In 3 quick brush strokes, whir of wings, wind through feathers, the shape of a falcon, rising over the high walls of Asgard and turning east, the morning light catching on the back of the wings as he climbed, the small distant shape of him crossing the rainbow bridge of Bifrost and then crossing beyond it into the long country between Asgard and Jȯtunheimr. Thor, on the ground in front of Freyja's hall, watched him go. Thor said nothing. Freyja stood beside him. She said quietly, "He will find it." Thor said, "I hope so." And the two of them stood in the dawn, in the long shadow of Freyja's hall, with the great necklace of Brísingamen catching the morning light, and they waited for Loki to come back. Chapter 3. The Hall of Þrymr. Loki flew east. The Þrymskviða does not tell us how long the flight took. We can imagine, from the way the poem hints at distance, that it took most of a morning. The world between Asgard and Jոտунheimr is a long world. The lands roll under a falcon's wings for hour after hour. The forests of the middle country pass below. The rivers cross the falcon's path like long silver threads. The small farms of Midgard, the country of men, pass below in their slow patchwork of green and brown. The high mountains of the eastern border rise. The falcon climbs over the mountains. The falcon crosses the great cold passes of the high country. And then, somewhere on the far side, the falcon comes down out of the high air into the country of the Jotnar, Jոտунheimr. The country was, the poem implies, in the way the Old North always implied, vast, cold, stony, vast pine forests stretching in every direction, high cliffs of dark stone, cold rivers running between cold rocks, halls of the Jotnar standing alone in clearings, with thin lines of smoke rising from the smoke holes of their roofs, cattle of the Jotnar grazing in the long meadows, herds larger than any herd in Midgard. The country went on for as far as the falcon's eyes could see. Loki, in falcon shape, began to look. He looked for a hall that was bigger than the others. He looked for a hall that had recently been visited by something important. He looked for a hall where the wood smoke smelled different, where the cooking fire smelled of feasting, where the hangings outside were the bright hangings of a hall preparing for a celebration. He looked, in the way the Old North's tricksters looked, for the small signs of a being who had just done something that he was very proud of, and he found it. The Þrymskviða does not give us a detailed description of Þrymr's hall, but the poem implies, in a few small details, that the hall was large, that it was new, that it stood on a flat shelf of rock above a wide pasture in which a great many cattle grazed. The roof was thatched with new straw. The doors were thrown open. The hall was already preparing for some event, some celebration, some announcement, something the giant who lived there was very pleased about. Loki, in falcon shape, came down through the cold air of the eastern country and landed on the long stone wall in front of Þrymr's hall. He sat on the wall in falcon shape. He turned his head, the way a falcon does, with the quick, small movement that takes in the whole landscape in 3 turns of the neck. He looked at the hall. He looked at the pasture. He looked at the cattle. And then, looking back at the hall, he saw the figure he had come to find. Þrymr was sitting on a high stone seat outside his hall. The Þrymskviða gives us, here, one of the small precious images of the poem. Þrymr, the king of the Jոտnar, of the eastern country, the lord of the Thursas, the one whom the poem calls Þrymr. Þrymr was sitting on his stone seat in the morning sun, calm, satisfied, the way a man sits when he has just done a thing that he believes is going to bring him a very great prize. He was weaving collars for his hunting dogs. The poem records this in a single quick line. He was weaving gold collars for his dogs. He was trimming the manes of his horses. The horses, the poem says, were large and dark, with black coats that gleamed in the morning sun. Þrymr was sitting on his stone seat in the bright morning, with the collars across his lap, and the great hunting dogs of his hall lying at his feet, and the horses of his hall grazing in the pasture, and he was waiting. He was waiting, the poem implies, with the patience of a being who knew what he was waiting for. Loki, in falcon shape, watched him. Þrymr, after a moment, looked up. He saw the small falcon on the wall. He recognized it. The Þrymskviða gives us, here, the small detail that Þrymr, even though he was a giant of the eastern country, even though he had probably never met Loki face to face, Þrymr immediately recognized the falcon as one of the messengers of Ásgarðr. He had heard of Freyja's cloak. He had heard of the gods who borrowed it. He understood, the way creatures of the Old North understood these things, that the falcon on his wall was not a wild falcon. Þrymr said, in the open air, without standing up, "Well, Loki of the Aesir, what brings you to my hall?" The Þrymskviða gives this line to Þrymr exactly. He addresses Loki by name. He calls him Loki of the Aesir. He speaks calmly, as if he has been expecting the visit for some time. Loki, on the wall, took the feather cloak off. He became Loki again, standing on the top of the long stone wall in the morning light of Jȯtunheimr, thin, pale, cold-eyed, wearing his traveling cloak underneath the falcon skin, which he now folded over his arm. Loki said, "Þrymr, lord of the Thursas, I have come for a thing that we believe is in your possession." Þrymr did not, the poem records, look surprised. Þrymr did not pretend ignorance. Þrymr did not, in the long Norse way, even try to bluff. Þrymr simply, with the calm of a man who has been waiting for this question, raised his head a little. Þrymr said, "What thing?" Loki said, "Thor's hammer." A small silence. Þrymr smiled. It was not a friendly smile. It was the smile of a being who has been waiting, for a long time, to be asked exactly this question, and who has been preparing his answer for as long as he has been waiting. Þrymr did not stand up. Þrymr did not call for any of his giants. Þrymr did not, the poem implies, even raise his voice. Þrymr said, "I have hidden Mjolnir, 8 leagues underground. No being will ever find it. No being will ever lift it. No being will ever take it from where I have put it. Loki said, "What do you want for it?" The Þrymskviða records the exchange in 3 short stanzas, and the exchange is the heart of this chapter. Loki, in the old way, did not argue. Loki, in the old way, did not threaten. Loki simply asked the only question a being like Þrymr would understand. "What is your price?" Þrymr leaned forward a little on his stone seat. His smile grew wider. He said, "Bring me Freyja as my bride in 8 nights' time, and on the morning of the wedding, when she comes to my hall, when she takes the marriage vows with me, when she is mine, on that morning and not a moment before, I will give back Thor's hammer." Chapter 4. The Demand. Loki did not, the poem records, respond immediately. Loki, on the stone wall, with the feather cloak folded over his arm, looked at Þrymr for a long moment without speaking. The poem does not tell us what Loki was thinking in that long moment, but we can imagine. We can imagine that Loki, the trickster, who lived by the small, careful calculation of how impossible things could be made possible, Loki was already turning the demand over in his mind. Freyja as bride, in 8 nights, the wedding to be performed in Þrymr's hall, the hammer to be returned only after the marriage was complete. It was, Loki understood, an impossible demand. Freyja would not, Loki knew with great certainty, agree to it, and even if Freyja agreed, even if somehow the gods of Asgard pressured her into the agreement, once the wedding was performed, once she was Þrymr's bride, the gods would have given the giants a much greater prize than just the hammer. They would have given them Freyja herself. Freyja, the goddess of love. Freyja, the goddess of fertility. Freyja, the older Vanir goddess, whose magic was older than the Aesir. The giants, having Freyja as their queen, would be able to bring such terrible weather, such terrible failures of crops, such terrible barrenness of beasts on the lands of the gods that Asgard might fall within a generation. It was, Loki understood, a demand designed to be impossible. Þrymr was not, Loki understood, asking for Freyja because he thought he could have her. Þrymr was asking for Freyja because he knew the gods could not give her, and the gods could not get their hammer back, and Þrymr would have what he had always wanted, which was Mjolnir hidden 8 leagues underground in his own land, and the gods of Asgard, without their greatest weapon, and the long, slow tilting of the worlds toward a future in which the giants might at last be greater than the gods. Loki understood all of this. Loki, in his cold-eyed way, did not show that he understood any of it. Loki said, "I will bring your demand to the gods." Þrymr said, "Do." Loki bowed in the small way the old Norse tricksters bowed when they wanted to acknowledge a transaction that was not yet complete. He put the falcon cloak back around his shoulders. He became, again, the falcon. He launched into the cold morning air of Jȯtunheimr, and he turned, and he flew back west toward Asgard with the demand of Þrymr, the lord of the Thursas, the king of the eastern country, wrapped in his mind like a small dark stone. He flew fast. The flight back to Asgard was, the poem implies, faster than the flight out. Loki had something to tell, and Loki, the poem implies, had already begun to think, even in the air, even with the wind in his feathers, about how the impossible demand of Þrymr might be turned in some small impossible way into a possible demand. A demand that might, with the right cleverness, be answered without giving Þrymr the prize he was really asking for. Loki, the poem implies, was already in flight beginning to work the problem. By the time he came down out of the western sky onto the long grass of Idavollr in the late afternoon light, Loki had, though the poem does not say so out loud, Loki had a plan. It was a very strange plan. It was a plan that required the cooperation of the strongest god in Asgard. It was a plan that required Thor to do a thing that Thor would not, in his ordinary life, ever have considered doing. Loki landed. He pulled the falcon cloak off. He became Loki again. Thor was still standing in front of Freyja's hall, exactly where Loki had left him. Freyja was beside him, with the great necklace Brísingamen still around her neck, with the dawn long since past, and the late afternoon light now slanting across the open space of Idavollr. Thor turned. Thor said, "What did you find?" Loki said, "I found Þrymr, the king of the Thursars. He has Mjolnir." Thor said, "Where?" Loki said, 8 leagues underground, in his own land. He will not give it back unless we pay him for it." Thor said, "What does he want?" Loki, the poem records, paused for a moment. The poem does not tell us why he paused. We can imagine that Loki, with his cold-eyed practical mind, wanted to deliver the news in such a way that the news did not immediately cause Thor to take a sword and start swinging it. We can imagine that Loki was choosing his words. Loki said he wants Freyja as his bride. The poem records Freyja's reaction in one of its most famous lines. The poem says, simply, that Freyja snorted. Chapter 5. The Refusal. She snorted. That is the line the Þrymskviða gives us, and the line is one of the small, great moments of the poem. Freyja, hearing what Loki had just said, did not, the poem implies, speak first, did not curse, did not raise her voice, did not, in any human sense, react in the way that the Old North would have expected a furious goddess to react. Freyja simply, in the moment of hearing the demand, drew in a long, deep breath and pushed it out through her nostrils. A snort. It is the kind of sound a horse makes when a thing it cannot accept has just been put in front of it. It is the kind of sound that does not contain any words, because the words have not yet been arranged, because the anger is still in the body and has not yet reached the throat. It is the small first physical sign of a goddess realizing what has just been said to her. The Þrymskviða gives this snort, in the original Old Norse, in a single word, fanasadi, shifnasadi. She snorted with anger, and the snort, the poem records, was so violent, was so full of the deep, cold, ancient anger of an old Vanir goddess who had just been told what her colleagues at the door wanted to bargain her away for, that the great hall of Freyja shook on its foundations. The great walls of the hall trembled, the Brísingamen, the great necklace of fire that lived around her throat, the necklace forged by 4 dwarves in a cave under a mountain in some ancient time before the gods were named. The Brísingamen broke, or rather, the poem says, the Brísingamen burst from her neck, the clasp of it sprang open, the chain of it leapt up from her throat, the 4 small dwarf stones of it scattered, for one quick moment, into the air of her hall, stuck of Halsimen. The necklace leapt from her neck. The Brísingamen fell. It fell onto the long wooden floor of Freyja's hall, where it lay in a small bright pile of light, like a small fallen star. Freyja did not pick it up. Freyja, the poem records, was looking at Loki. The Þrymskviða gives us this look in a single careful line. Freyja looked at Loki, and Loki who had stared down Jոտnir, Loki who had walked across the long roads of the worlds with the most dangerous of beings as his companions, Loki who would in the end be the cause of the ending of all things. Loki, in this moment, took a small step back. The poem does not record what Loki said in that moment. The poem records only Freyja's response. Freyja said, "Do you think I am a goddess so full of love for men that I would marry a Jotun to get a hammer back?" The poem renders this in 2 short stanzas. The first contains Freyja's question. The second contains a single line that the Old North loved, that the Old North repeated, that the Old North preserved for hundreds of years in this single poem. Mik veist verda vergernasta, efik med til Jåtunheimr. You would have me be the most husband-mad of all the women in the world if I went with you to Jåtunheimr. It is one of the great lines of the Old North. The line is a refusal. The line is also, in the small, dry old way of the Eddic poems, a joke. Freyja was not, the poem implies, going to marry Þrymr. Freyja was not, the poem implies, going to even consider marrying Þrymr. The idea was so monstrous that Freyja had no other response except to point out, very dryly, that the gods would have to think very poorly of her to imagine that she would. The gods, the poem implies, took the point. Thor, in the doorway of Freyja's hall, did not speak. Loki, who had taken a small step back, did not speak either. The Brísingamen lay on the floor. Freyja, after a long moment, knelt down very slowly and picked up the necklace. She held it in her hands for a moment, looking at the small dwarf stones of it in the long fading afternoon light. The clasp of the necklace had not broken. The necklace had simply leapt off her throat in the moment of her anger. She fastened it back around her own neck, very carefully, very deliberately, with the small, careful movements of a woman who is restoring order to a thing that has been disordered. She stood up. She looked at Thor. She looked at Loki. She said, "Find another way." And she turned, and she went back into her hall, and she closed the door behind her. The Þrymskviða gives us this gesture, the closing of the door, without any further explanation. The door closed. Freyja was inside her hall. The 2 gods were outside. The question of how to recover Mjolnir was, now, entirely the gods' problem. Freyja had refused. The refusal was final. The gods would have to find another way. Thor, in the late afternoon light, looked at Loki. Thor said, "We should call a council." Loki, the poem implies, agreed. Loki nodded. Loki, who already, the poem implies, had a plan, but who was not yet ready to share that plan with anyone, least of all with Thor. Loki nodded, and the 2 of them turned, and they walked together across the long open space of Vidavallar toward the great hall of Counsel that stood at the center of Asgard, where the gods met when the gods had a problem they could not solve alone. They called the council. Chapter 6. The Council of the Gods. The gods came. The Þrymskviða does not give us a long list of who was at the council, but we can imagine, from the way the poem implies the gathering, that everyone came. Odin, the Allfather, Frigg, his wife, with her quiet eyes, Tyr, the one-handed god, Heimdallr, the watcher of the Rainbow Bridge, with his great horn at his side, Freyr, brother of Freyja, the lord of fertility, Idun, keeper of the apples of youth, with her hair the color of wheat, Sif, Thor's wife, with her golden hair, Baldur. Yes, the Þrymskviða takes place before the death of Baldur, and so Baldur was at this council, the bright son of Odin, whose loss would one day begin the great tilting of the world toward Ragnarok. Baldur was there, the poem implies, sitting at the long table with the others. The gods sat in a circle. Thor stood at the center. He told them, in the small, careful way that even Thor knew how to use when the situation called for it, what had happened. The hammer. the empty floor by the bed, the visit to Freyja, the borrowing of the cloak, Loki's flight east, Þrymr's demand. Then he said, Freyja will not go. The gods, the poem records, all turned to look at Freyja, who was at the council. Freyja, with the Brísingamen back around her neck, looked at the gods. Freyja, the poem implies, did not need to say anything. The gods knew. The gods understood. The gods, the poem implies, would not have asked her to go, even if Thor had not already said she would not. There was a long silence. The gods of Asgard, the Þrymskviða implies, did not have a ready answer. The problem was, on its face, impossible. The hammer was gone. The giants would not return it without Freyja. Freyja would not be given. The hammer would not, by any path any of them could see, be coming back. And then, in the small, clear voice of the watcher of the Rainbow Bridge, Heimdallr spoke. The Þrymskviða gives us Heimdallr's speech, with all the dignity the Old North could give to a difficult suggestion. The Havamal, the old wisdom poem of the North, the long sequence of plain, quiet sayings that Odin himself was said to have spoken, preserved in the Codex Regius alongside the Þrymskviða itself, has a line for moments like this one. It is better, the Havamal says, to give a friend a wise word than to give him bread. The bread will be gone by morning. The word may save his life. Heimdallr was the kind of friend who gave the word. Heimdallr, the white god, the foreseeing one, the one whose hearing was so sharp that he could hear the grass growing on the ground and the wool growing on a sheep's back, the one whose eyes could see 100 leagues in any direction, the one whose horn would one day announce the beginning of Ragnarok. Heimdallr stood up at the council. He looked at the gods. He looked finally at Thor. Heimdallr said, "There's a way." The gods turned to him. Heimdallr said, "We dress Thor as the bride." A small silence. The poem records this silence with one of its few overt notes of comedy. The gods did not, the poem implies, immediately respond. The gods, the poem implies, were taking in what Heimdallr had said. They were turning it over. They were looking at Thor, at the great red-bearded god, at the broad shoulders, at the strong arms, at the everything about him that was not, in any conceivable way, a bride. They were trying to imagine what Heimdallr had just suggested. Heimdallr, sensing the silence, continued. He said, "We put the bride's gown on him. We put the bride's veil on him. We put the Brísingamen around his neck. He travels east in the goat chariot to Þrymr's hall. He goes through the wedding feast. At the moment when the hammer is brought out, at the moment when, by the customs of the Jոտnar, Mjolnir is laid on the bride's knees as the blessing of the marriage, at that moment, Thor seizes his hammer back and ends the wedding. The gods, the poem implies, began, slowly, to understand. It was a plan. It was a strange plan. It was a plan that turned on a single piece of the old Norse marriage customs that the gods all knew. When a giant married, the great hammer of the giant, the symbol of his power and his protection, was brought out at the wedding feast and laid on the bride's knees. It was the blessing of the marriage. It was the moment that consecrated the union. It was the moment that, by the old laws of the Jոտnar, made the wedding final. If Mjolnir was brought out to bless this wedding, and the wedding was for Thor's hammer, and Þrymr had no other hammer of his own that could match it, then Mjolnir would be brought out to bless the wedding, and Mjolnir, brought to be laid on the bride's knees, would be brought directly into reach of the bride who was not a bride. The gods, the poem implies, began to nod. Loki, sitting beside the council, smiled his small, cold smile. Loki said, "Yes." Thor, the poem records, did not smile. The Þrymskviða gives us Thor's response in one of its small, great lines. Thor said, "They will call me unmanly." The poem records this objection with all the seriousness the Old North could give to a question of honor. Thor, for whom honor was not an abstract concept, for whom honor was the small, everyday thing of being a god who was known and feared and respected. Thor could not, the poem implies, imagine himself putting on a bride's gown. The gown would not, in the Old North, simply be a costume. The gown would be a public act of becoming the thing the gown represented. The gods of Asgard would see him in it. The giants of JÓtunheimr would see him in it. The skalds of the long winters afterward would tell stories about him in it. The men of Midgard, in their long cold halls, would, for many generations to come, laugh in their cups about the time the strongest god of Asgard had put on a bride's gown. Thor could not, in that moment, accept it. The poem records this objection in a single famous line. Thor said, "Argr." Argr is one of the great words of the Old North. It means, and the meaning is not translatable in any single English word, it means unmanly, but it means more than that. It means a man who has given up his manhood. It means a man who has accepted the role of the woman. It means, in the Old Norse warrior honor culture, the single most insulting word that could be said of a man. To be Argr was to be unworthy of the company of men. To be Argr was to be exiled from the warrior's hall. To be Argr was, in some old laws, to be killable without consequence. Thor was saying that he could not, by going through with this plan, do that to himself. The gods, the poem records, looked at one another, Loki, and this is one of the small moments where the poem lets us see Loki's intelligence at its sharpest. Loki stood up. Loki said, "Shut up, Thor." The Þrymskviða records this with exactly that bluntness. "Thegi thu Thor," the poem says, "Shut up, Thor." Loki was the only being in Asgard who could say a thing like that to Thor and survive. He said it. The gods, the poem implies, did not flinch. They knew Loki was speaking for all of them. Loki said, "Think." Loki said, "If you do not go to Þrymr's hall, if you do not do this thing, the Jotnar will rule Asgard within the year. They will come here. They will sit on our seats. They will take our halls. They will be the masters of this place where you and I and all of these other gods have lived for as long as any of us can remember. They will end us. Mjolnir is the thing that has kept the Jotnar out of Asgard. Without Mjolnir, the Jotnar come in. You know this. You have always known this. The choice is not between wearing a bride's gown and not wearing a bride's gown. The choice is between wearing a bride's gown for one day and watching everything we have ever cared about being ground under the feet of the Jotnar for the rest of time. Thor, the poem records, looked at Loki for a long moment. Then he looked at Freyja. Then he looked at Sif, his wife, who was sitting at the council with her hair, the color of gold, falling down her back. Sif, the poem implies, did not say anything. She did not need to. The two of them, Thor and Sif, had been married long enough to know each other in the small, quiet way that long married beings know each other. Thor was asking her, with one look across the council, whether she could bear what was about to happen, whether she could sit in her hall in Asgard for the next 8 nights, knowing that her husband was on his way east in a bride's gown to be married to another being, whether she could bear the long, quiet humiliation of knowing that her husband had agreed to put on the veil of another woman, and not just any other woman, but the most beautiful goddess in Asgard, the goddess of love herself, whose necklace would, for the long ride east, be lying against her husband's collarbones. Sif, the poem implies, considered all of this for one long, quiet moment, and then she gave him the only answer that mattered. She nodded, once, slowly, with the small, calm steadiness of a woman who had known, since the morning her husband had walked into her hall to tell her his hammer was gone, that some price would have to be paid, and who had decided, long before the council had even been called, that whatever the price was, she would, in her own way, help him pay it. Sif, the old North remembered, had reason to be cautious about the cleverness of Loki. It had been Loki, in some older story, who had once crept into her bedroom in the night and cut off her hair while she slept. Sif knew what the cleverness of Loki could cost. She knew that the plans of Loki, even when they worked, were not the kind of plans that came without consequence. She knew that the gown she was now allowing her husband to wear was, in some small way, going to cost her too. She nodded anyway. That was, the poem implies, what marriage in the Old North could be at its best. Two beings who had been together long enough to know what the other was asking, and who could, when the cost was high and the moment came, give each other the small, calm answer that made the next hard thing possible. It was permission, the wife's permission, the permission on the gods of Asgard in the form of one calm look from his own wife to do the thing he was being asked to do. Thor, the poem records, said one word. He said, "Very well." And the gods, the poem implies, with one of its rare moments of collective relief, the gods exhaled. The plan had been accepted. Thor would go. The wedding would be performed. The hammer would be brought out. Mjolnir would, by the old laws of the Jotnar, be laid on the bride's knees for the blessing of the marriage. And after that, the poem implies, the old laws of the Jotnar would no longer matter. After that, the old laws of any of the worlds would no longer matter. After that, there would be only Thor and Mjolnir and a hall full of giants. Chapter 7. The Bridal Veil. The gods went to work. The Þrymskviða gives this chapter in a few quick stanzas, and the chapter is the small precious comedy of the poem. The gods of Asgard, with their council ended, went together with Thor into the great hall of Freyja, where the dresses of Asgard's women were kept, and they began to dress Thor as a bride. It did not go quickly. The gown was, the poem implies, the first problem. The bride's gown of a goddess like Freyja was a fine, close-fitted thing, long, falling to the floor, with embroidered patterns at the hem and the sleeves. It was not made for the shoulders of Thor. The shoulders of Thor were the shoulders of the strongest god in Asgard. The gown, when they tried to fasten it across his chest, would not close. The skalds in the long winter halls would tell, for centuries afterward, the story of how the gods of Asgard had to let out the seams of Freyja's wedding gown to fit it around Thor's shoulders, and how the women of Freyja's household stood around with needles and thread, very calmly, very seriously, doing the work that needed to be done. The gown was finally fastened. Then the necklace. Freyja, the poem implies, took the Brísingamen off her own neck and placed it around Thor's. The 4 small dwarf stones of the necklace, in the late afternoon light of Freyja's hall, lay against Thor's collarbones. Freyja did this, the poem implies, without any expression. The gods were going to use her necklace to deceive a giant. Her necklace would, by the end of the day, be in the hall of Þrymr. Her necklace would be the one piece of her that would, in some small way, be present at the wedding she was not attending. She fastened the clasp. She stepped back. Then the keys. The bride of a Norse household carried around her belt a set of keys. The keys were the symbol of the bride's coming authority over the household. The keys to the food store, the keys to the chest, the keys to the great storehouse where the household kept the things that mattered. Thor, as the bride, would need to wear these keys. The gods, the poem implies, found a set of bride's keys somewhere in Freyja's hall, and they fastened them to Thor's belt. The keys hung against his hip. The keys clinked very softly every time he moved. Then the rings. The bride of a Norse household wore rings, gold rings on her fingers, a great brooch at her shoulder. The gods of Asgard found these things and put them on Thor. Then the veil. The veil was the last and the most important of all the bride's garments. The veil was the white linen cloth that covered the bride's head and face. The veil hid the bride from the eyes of the wedding guest until the moment at the end of the wedding feast when the husband raised the veil and saw for the first time the face of the woman he had married. The veil was the great symbol of the bride. The veil was the thing that, by the customs of the Old North, made the wedding a wedding. Freyja, the poem implies, brought out a veil of fine white linen. She held it for a moment in her hands. Thor, and we can imagine this, even though the poem does not say it, Thor stood very still. He had been standing very still for some time now. He had been standing very still while the seamstresses had let out the seams of the gown. He had been standing very still while the Brísingamen had been fastened around his throat. He had been standing very still while the keys had been hung at his belt and the rings had been placed on his fingers. He had not, in any of those small unmakings of himself, said anything. He had simply stood. He had let the gods of Asgard do to him what they needed to do. He had, the poem implies, with all the dignity the Old North could find for him, he had held his breath somewhere deep in his chest, and he had let the bride be made out of him. The veil was the last piece. Once the veil came down, the unmaking would be complete. Once the veil came down, the gods of Asgard would look at him and see not Thor, but Freyja. Once the veil came down, the long ride east would begin, and the long humiliation, and the long careful pretending in the giant's hall. Freyja set the veil on Thor's head. She pulled it down over his face. Thor, behind the veil, did not move. He could see, the poem implies, and this small detail is one the Old North would have understood. Thor could see the gods of Asgard through the veil. The veil was a thin linen. Light came through it. The shapes of the gods who had dressed him were visible on the other side of the white cloth, but the gods of Asgard could no longer easily see his face. The veil hid him. The veil was, for the first time since he had taken Mjolnir off his belt the previous evening, a barrier between Thor and the world. The poem records this moment in its small, dignified way, in a single line. Thor was now dressed. He was, by every outward sign, the bride. Freyja's gown, Freyja's necklace, the bride's keys, the bride's rings, the bride's veil. He was, in every visible way, ready to be married to the king of the Jոտnar of the eastern country. Loki, watching, smiled his small, cold smile. Loki said, "She will need a handmaiden." The Þrymskviða gives this moment to Loki in one of its small, lovely lines. Loki, who had been the architect of the whole impossible plan, Loki was not content to send Thor east alone. Thor, in a bride's veil, would, at the very first awkward word, give the whole thing away. Thor did not have the gift of words. Thor did not have the gift of social grace. Thor was the god of thunder, not the god of polite conversation at a wedding feast in a giant's hall. Thor would need a bridesmaid, a handmaiden who could speak for him, who could explain his strangenesses, who could deflect questions, who could, when the giant's eyes lingered too long on the bride, give the kind of clever, quick answer that would turn the questioning aside. Loki, the poem implies, knew exactly who that handmaiden should be. Loki said, "I will be the handmaiden." The gods, the poem records, did not object. The gods understood. The plan would not work without Loki. Loki, in a handmaiden's gown, with his cold eyes and his quick tongue and his small smile, was exactly the being who could keep Thor from being recognized at the wedding feast of Þrymr. The gods dressed Loki. The poem records this in a single quick image. They put a handmaiden's gown on him, a simple linen dress, more modest than the bride's, a cap on his head, a small bundle of belongings, the way a handmaiden traveling with her bride would have carried, slung over his shoulder. Loki, in handmaiden's clothes, looked, the poem implies, convincingly like a handmaiden. Loki had always been able to take any shape he chose. The handmaiden's gown was not, for Loki, a hard costume. Thor, behind the veil, said one word. He said, "Loki." Loki said yes. Thor said, "Do not let me kill you on the road east." Loki, the poem implies, did not promise anything. Loki only smiled his small, cold smile. The gods, the poem records, walked the two of them, the bride and the bridesmaid, out into the open air of Idavollr, where Thor's chariot of goats was waiting, and where the long road east lay open under the late afternoon sky. Chapter 8. The Road East. They climbed into the chariot. Thor's chariot, the Þrymskviða, gives us in a single quick image, was drawn by two great goats. The poem does not name them in this stanza, but the Old North would have known their names. They were Tangrisnir, the gap-toothed, and Tangjostr, the tooth-gnasher. Two great goats with horns curving above their heads, with shaggy coats the color of late autumn grass, with hooves shod in brass. They drew the chariot of Thor across the worlds when he traveled. They drew it now. Thor, in his bride's veil, sat down in the chariot. Loki, in his handmaiden's gown, sat down beside him. The gods of Asgard, standing on the long grass of Idavollr, watched them go. Sif was there. Freyja was there. Odin was there. Heimdallr, with his great horn, was there. None of them, the poem implies, spoke. There was nothing to say. The bride and the bridesmaid were on their way. The gods could only watch and hope and wait for the chariot to come back with a hammer in it. Thor took up the reins of the goat chariot. He shouted, the poem implies, in his great voice, the voice that was the same whether he wore a bride's veil or not. He shouted at the goats. The goats started forward. The chariot lurched. The wheels began to turn. The chariot picked up speed. And here the Þrymskviða gives us one of its small great lines. The poem says, in two careful stanzas, that the chariot went east at such speed, and Thor drove the goats with such fury at having to make this journey at all, that the road behind them caught fire. The rock split, the mountain shook, the earth burned with flame. Bjorg Brustu, Bran Jord Loga. It is one of the famous lines of the Old Norse corpus. The mountain shattered, the earth burned with flame. The poem is, in this single line, giving us a window into the cosmic temper of Thor in this moment. Thor was not happy. Thor was driving his chariot east at the speed of his own fury at the situation he had been placed in. The road behind him, in the wake of the chariot's wheels, was a long line of cracked rock and burning grass. The mountains on either side of his path were trembling. Loki, in his handmaiden's gown, hung onto the side of the chariot. The Þrymskviða does not record what Loki said in that moment. We can imagine that Loki, with his cold-eyed pragmatism, was thinking that they needed to slow down, that arriving at Þrymr's hall with the visible signs of cosmic disturbance trailing behind them would not, perhaps, help with the disguise. We can imagine Loki turning his head and the wind catching at his small handmaiden's cap, and Loki saying something quiet and sharp to Thor through the noise of the wheels. We can imagine Thor, behind his veil, breathing in, breathing out, pulling the reins a little, slowing the goats. The fire behind them died down. The chariot, by the time it crossed the long border into Jȯtunheimr, was no longer trailing cosmic disturbance behind it. It was just a chariot, a bride and her handmaiden, two great goats pulling them across the cold country. The journey was, by then, a quieter journey. The country grew rougher. The forest grew darker. The cattle of the Jotnar grazed in the high pastures on either side of the road. The smoke of the Jotnar's halls rose in long, thin lines from the small clearings between the trees. They drove east. They drove east through the late afternoon and into the long blue evening of Jȯtunheimr. The Havamal opens with a verse for the kind of crossing the chariot was making. At every doorway, the old poem says, "Before you go in, look around carefully. You never know what enemy is already sitting on the bench within." The bench within Þrymr's hall that evening was lined with enemies. And as the evening grew, the great hall of Þrymr came into sight on the horizon. The new straw of its roof, the doors thrown open, the cooking fires already burning. The hall, the poem implies, was already at full preparation for the wedding. Þrymr, the king of the Jotnar, was waiting. The Þrymskviða gives us the next moment in one of its small great touches. Þrymr, when he saw the chariot coming up the long road from the west, Þrymr stood up from his stone seat outside the hall. Þrymr called to his giants. Þrymr's voice carried across the pasture and through the open doors of the hall. Þrymr said, "Stand up, Jotnar. She is coming. Freyja, the daughter of the Vanir, is coming to my hall to be my bride, to bring me the great prize my hammer theft has won." The Þrymskviða records his speech with all the small, awful pride of a giant who is about to be very badly fooled. Þrymr says, in the next stanza, that he has many gold-horned cattle, many black oxen, many things in his hall, many treasures, many fine gems and rings, and that all of these things would mean nothing to him until tonight, when at last he would have Freyja. The poem records this with a small, dry irony. The poem knows that Þrymr has just said the last thing he will ever say with any of his old confidence. The chariot rolled to a stop in front of the hall. The bride climbed down. The handmaiden climbed down. The goat stood, breathing hard, in the cold blue evening light. The bride, with her veil down over her face, was led by Þrymr's hand. Þrymr, the poem implies, took her hand at the door of the hall, and the bride's hand was, even through the gown, even through the long sleeve, even through the embroidered cuff, a hand of strange and unusual size and weight. Þrymr led her in. The wedding feast began. Chapter 9. The Wedding Feast. The hall was full. The Þrymskviða gives us the wedding feast in 3 stanzas, and the 3 stanzas are the comic heart of the poem. The hall of Þrymr was filled with giants, cousins, brothers, sons, lords of the eastern country, lesser Jotnar of the surrounding mountains. The long tables of the hall were laid with food. The great hearth at the center of the hall was burning. The cooking fires in the side passages were sending up smoke through the open vents in the roof. The hall was loud with the voices of the giants, with the slow, heavy laughter of giants pleased about a wedding that was a triumph, with the small, bright clinking of bronze cups being filled with mead. The hall was warm. It was the warmth of a great cold country hall on a winter evening, the warmth of stone walls that had soaked up the heat of the cooking fires for hours, the warmth of bodies, and the bodies of Jotnar. The Old North knew were large bodies, hot bodies, bodies that gave off heat the way smaller bodies could not, the warmth of the rough wool clothes that the wedding guests were wearing, the long fur cloaks over the shoulders of the men, the heavy gowns of the women, the small steam that rose from the cups of hot spiced wine that were now being passed down the long tables. The hall was warm in a way that, the poem implies, the bride was feeling under her veil. The hall smelled, the poem implies, of many things at once. It smelled of roasting beef. It smelled of charred fat. It smelled of the long sweet smoke of pine wood burning in the great hearth, of the small sharp smoke of resinous branches being tossed in for fragrance, of the warm yeasty smell of bread baking in the side ovens. It smelled of mead, which is to say it smelled of honey, of fermented honey, of the warm spiced honey wine that the Jotnar of the eastern country were famous for, and that they were now bringing out in great oak barrels and pouring into the bronze cups of every guest in the hall. The hall sounded like a feast. The slow, heavy laughter of giants, the clinking of cups, the scrape of long knives on the wooden cutting boards as the carving women cut the roasted meats into portions, the small, quick footsteps of the serving children, who were the half-grown Jotnar of Þrymr's household, weaving in and out among the tables with platters held high, the voices in the rafters of the great hall, rising and falling, gathering into the long, low roar that any large feast in any large hall makes when the company has settled in and the mead has begun to do its work. And underneath all of it, very quietly, very steadily, the slow, careful breathing of the bride. Þrymr sat at the high seat at the head of the hall. Thor, the bride, with the veil down over his face, with Freyja's necklace at his throat, with the keys clinking at his belt, sat at Þrymr's right hand. Loki, the handmaiden, sat at Thor's right hand, ready to speak for him. The food came. The Þrymskviða gives us the menu of the wedding feast in a single careful stanza. Roasted ox, 8 salmon, all the delicate small dishes that were customarily made for the women of the feast, small breads, small honey cakes, small soft fruits, small cheeses, the kind of fine careful foods that a bride was expected to eat slowly, in small portions, behind her veil. The bride, the poem records, did not eat slowly. The bride ate the whole ox. The bride ate all 8 of the salmon. The bride ate every one of the small delicate dishes that had been prepared for the women. And then, the poem records, the bride called for mead, 3 barrels of mead. The bride drank. The Þrymskviða says, 3 barrels of mead in a single sitting. Þrymr, sitting in his high seat at the head of the hall, watched all of this. Þrymr's face, the poem implies, slowly changed. The poem gives us, in one of its famous lines, Þrymr's reaction. Þrymr leaned over to where Loki was sitting at the bride's right hand. Þrymr spoke very softly. Þrymr said, "I never saw a bride bite more sharply. I never saw a maiden eat more food. I never saw a young woman drink more mead. It is one of the small comic gems of the Old North. Þrymr, the king of the Jotnar, the lord of the Thursas, the giant who has hidden Mjolnir 8 leagues underground. Þrymr is now leaning across the high table and quietly asking the handmaiden whether his bride is, perhaps, unusual." Loki, the poem records, was ready. Loki had, the poem implies, been preparing for exactly this question on the long ride east. Loki turned to Þrymr. Loki, in his handmaiden's voice, which the poem implies was a soft, careful voice, the kind of voice a respectful handmaiden of an old high-ranked goddess would use to address the giant who was about to become her mistress's husband. Loki gave Þrymr the answer. Loki said, "Freyja has not eaten in 8 nights. So eager was she to come to your hall, lord of the Thursas, so impatient was she to be your bride, that she has not slept, and has not eaten for the 8 nights since the demand was sent. Now, finally, in your hall, she is eating and drinking, because at last she is here." The poem gives us Þrymr's response in the smallest possible touch. Þrymr smiled. It was a smile of vanity. It was a smile of a being who, on hearing the explanation, found that he was very willing to believe the explanation, because the explanation flattered him. Freyja had been so eager for him, so hungry for the wedding, that she had not slept or eaten for 8 nights. Of course she had. He, Þrymr, was the giant she had been waiting for. He, Þrymr, was the king worthy of such hunger. Þrymr was satisfied. The feast continued. The bride, behind her veil, kept eating. Chapter 10. The Eye Beneath the Veil. The feast went on for some time. The Þrymskviða does not give us the length, but the poem implies that the meal stretched on through the long evening of Jȯtunheimr, with the cooking fires burning down, with the small, fine wedding foods being brought out by the women of Þrymr's household, with the mead going around in the great bronze cups, with the slow, heavy laughter of the giants growing slower and more affectionate as the wedding feast did the thing wedding feasts always do, which is bring the company into the warmth of a long shared meal. And at some point in the evening, the poem implies, Þrymr leaned over toward the bride. Þrymr wanted to kiss her. The Þrymskviða gives us the moment with all the small comic dread it can muster. Þrymr, the king of the Jotnar, the bridegroom, the man who had won the prize he'd been waiting for. Þrymr leaned across the high table toward the bride, who sat beside him, with her veil still down over her face. He wanted, the poem implies, to lift the veil and see the face of his bride. He reached out, he lifted the veil, just a little, just enough to see, in the warm hall light, the eyes of the woman he was about to be married to. Thor, the poem implies, could not move. The poem does not tell us this, but we can imagine it. Thor, sitting at the high seat at the head of the hall, with the great square iron head of Mjolnir still nowhere in his hands, with his hand still trapped under the embroidered sleeve of a bride's gown, with the giant's face 4 inches from his own face, and the giant's mouth coming closer with the slow, heavy intention of a kiss. Thor could not move, could not strike, could not stand up, could not, in any of the small old ways the god of thunder had ever solved a problem, solve this problem. Mjolnir was somewhere in the hall, on a cloth, in the hands of giants, being brought out in slow procession. Mjolnir was not yet in his lap. Mjolnir was not yet in his hand. Thor was, for 1 second of the long evening, the most vulnerable he had ever been in his life. Thor was a bride. Thor was unarmed. Thor was being kissed at by a giant. He held the eye contact. He had to. Looking away would have been the giveaway. Closing his eyes would have been the giveaway. Any flinch, any small involuntary turn of the head, any small reflexive setting of the jaw would have been the giveaway. Thor held the eye contact with the man he had ridden east to kill, with the man whose face was now closer to his own face than any face had ever been outside his own bed, and he held it, and he held his breath, and he held the small, slow burning fury of a god who had been brought to this point by the strangest series of small, impossible decisions any god had ever been brought to. And the burning the poem implies was visible. The fury came up through Thor's eyes, the way it had come up through his beard on the morning he had found his hammer gone. He could not contain it. He had been containing it all day. He had been containing it through the dressing. He had been containing it through the ride east. He had been containing it through the feast. The fury had been gathering in his chest, in his shoulders, in the muscles of his arms under the long embroidered sleeves. And now, in the small space between his face and Þrymr's, with no way to release it, the fury did the only thing it could do. It came out through his eyes. His eyes burned. His eyes burned the way coals at the bottom of a forge fire burn when the bellows have been working them for a long time. His eyes burned the way the iron of Mjolnir had burned in the great forging contest of the dwarves, Eitri and Brokkr, long ago, when the small pale flame at the bottom of the forge had been worked, breath after breath, into the bright white fury that the hammerhead had been pulled out of. His eyes burned. Þrymr saw them. He recoiled. The Þrymskviða gives this recoil in one of its great lines. Þrymr leapt back. Þrymr almost overturned his own high seat. Þrymr, the king of the Thursars, was, for the first time in this whole poem, afraid. The poem records, in Þrymr's own voice, what he had seen. Þrymr said, "Why are Freyja's eyes so terrible? Why do they burn like fire? Why are they not the eyes of a maiden?" The poem records this in one of its small, dignified stanzas. Þrymr's eyes had met, in the small space under the lifted edge of the veil, the eyes of Thor. And Thor's eyes, behind the veil, were not the eyes of Freyja. They were the eyes of the god who had spent the entire journey east burning with the fury of having to wear a bride's gown. They were the eyes of a being who had just eaten an entire ox and drunk 3 barrels of mead, and was, in the way only Thor could be, very awake. They were the eyes that, in the corners of the warm hall light, glowed like the small coals at the bottom of a forge fire. Þrymr saw them. And Þrymr, the giant who had been ready to laugh off any eccentricity of his bride, Þrymr, in this moment, almost saw through the disguise. Loki, the poem records, was ready again. The poem does not tell us what Loki was feeling in that second, but we can imagine. We can imagine that Loki, who had been the architect of the whole plan, who had ridden east with Thor, knowing that this exact moment would come, who had been rehearsing his lines for the long ride out, Loki, in the second, was feeling for the first time the full cold weight of what the plan had been asking him to carry. If the next sentence out of his mouth did not work, both of them would die in this hall. There were 100 giants in this room. There were weapons on every wall. Mjolnir was not in Thor's hand. The plan, the careful, impossible plan, was in this small space between Þrymr's leaning in face and the bride's burning eyes, and it lived or died on whether Loki could say one true-sounding sentence in the voice of a soft, careful handmaiden. Loki's heart, the poem implies, came up into his throat. Loki's voice, the poem implies, stayed very even. Loki, in his handmaiden's voice, and the poem implies that this is the moment when all of Loki's clever, cold thinking on the long road east was being repaid in a single critical exchange. Loki leaned in toward Þrymr. Loki said, "Lord of the Thyrses, do not be afraid." Freyja's eyes burn because for the same reason that she has eaten and drunk so much tonight, she has not slept for 8 nights. The 8 nights between the demand and the wedding, she has lain awake in her hall, so eager was she for you. Her eyes burn because they have not been closed. They will be calm again, Lord of the Thyrses, after she has rested in your bed. The Þrymskviða records Þrymr's reaction to the second explanation with the same small comic touch. Þrymr, who had almost seen through the disguise. Þrymr, on hearing Loki's explanation, again chose to believe it. He chose to believe it because the explanation, again, flattered him. Freyja's eyes burned with the hunger of love. Freyja's eyes had not slept because she could not stop thinking of him. Þrymr, in this moment, settled back onto his high seat. He smiled again. It was the small, dangerous smile of a giant who has chosen vanity over caution. It was the smile of a giant who was, the poem implies, about to die. But Þrymr did not yet know that. Þrymr, restored to his confidence by the explanation, Þrymr now decided that it was time. The feast had gone on long enough. The mead had been drunk. The food had been eaten. The hour had come for the moment that, by the old laws of the Jոտnar, would make the wedding final. Þrymr stood up at the high seat. Þrymr raised his voice across the hall. The Þrymskviða gives us his speech in one of the great anticipated moments of the entire poem. Þrymr said, "Bring out the hammer." Chapter 11. The Hammer on the Knee. A small silence fell across the hall. The Þrymskviða gives us this silence in a single quick line. The giants of Þrymr's hall, hearing the king's command, stopped their conversations. The clinking of cups stopped. The laughter stopped. The hall was, for one moment, completely still, because the giants knew what was about to happen. The bringing out of the hammer at a giant wedding was the great consecrating moment of the marriage. The hammer of the bridegroom, the symbol of his power and of the protection he would now extend over his bride, was carried out by the bridegroom's men. It was laid on the bride's knees. The bride, by accepting the hammer on her knees, accepted the protection of her husband. The husband, by laying the hammer on her knees, gave that protection. It was the moment that, by the old laws of the Jոտnar, the laws older than any of the laws of the gods, made the wedding final. Þrymr's giants brought out the hammer. The Þrymskviða does not give us the details of the procession, but the poem implies that the hammer was carried by several giants. Mjolnir was a heavy weapon, and even in the hall of Þrymr, the bringing out of it was a procession. They carried it on a cloth. They carried it slowly, with the great care that the moment required. The hammer, the poem implies, was the great hammer, Mjolnir of Thor, with its short, heavy haft and its great square iron head, with the small marks on the head where the dwarves Eitri and Brokkr had finished it in the deep places of the worlds. It was, after 8 long nights, no longer 8 leagues underground. It was, after 8 long nights, finally back in the same room as Thor. The giants approached the high table. They carried the hammer to where the bride was sitting beside Þrymr. They, by the old custom of the Jոտnir, laid Mjolnir on the bride's knees. The Þrymskviða gives us, here, the line that the Old North preserved more carefully than almost any other line in the entire poem. The line is Hlo, Hlorida, Hugur, I brjósti. It means, the heart of Thor laughed in his breast. Thor, who had been silent through the whole feast, who had eaten an ox and 8 salmon, and drunk 3 barrels of mead, who had stared out at Þrymr through the veil with eyes that almost gave him away, who had been carried east in a bride's gown against every instinct of his honor. Thor, in this single quiet moment, when the haft of his own hammer touched the cloth of the gown across his own knees, when his hand, hidden under the embroidered sleeve of the bride's gown, closed around the haft that he had not held in 8 nights. Thor's heart laughed in his breast. It is one of the small great lines of the entire Old Norse corpus. The heart of Thor laughed, not aloud, not so that any of the giants in the hall heard it. The poem is careful about this. The laughter was internal. The laughter was the small recognition, deep in Thor's chest, that the long humiliating journey, the gown, the keys, the necklace, the veil, the 8 salmon, the 3 barrels of mead, the careful explanations of Loki, all of it had brought him here, to this moment, with his hand around the haft of Mjolnir, in the hall of Þrymr, with the giants of the eastern country gathered around him in their long wedding feast clothes, weapons at their sides but not in their hands, the slow heavy laughter of a feast still echoing in the rafters of the hall. The laughter was also, the poem implies, something else. The laughter was the moment in which a being who had spent the whole day being someone he was not, being a bride, being a quiet woman, being a thing the gown had made him, felt himself, in one small private second, become himself again. The hand under the embroidered sleeve was his own hand. The hand was the hand that had held this hammer 10,000 times. The hand knew the haft. The haft knew the hand. The wood of the haft had, over the long years, taken the shape of his grip. The grip now slid back into the place the haft had been waiting for it to slide. The hammer remembered him. He remembered the hammer. Under the veil, behind the gown, with the Brísingamen at his throat and the bride's keys at his belt, and the small bright rings of the bride still on his fingers, Thor, for one small space of one held breath, with his hand on his own hammer, for the first time in 8 nights, Thor was, again, Thor. The bride was not the bride. The bride was the god of thunder. And the god of thunder, the poem implies, was about to be the god of thunder again. Thor was Thor again. Mjolnir was Mjolnir again. The plan, the careful, impossible plan of Loki, had worked. There is a verse in the Havamal that says, "Praise the day at evening. Praise the woman after she is buried. Praise the weapon when it has been tried." Mjolnir, that night, was about to be tried. The Þrymskviða gives us the next moment in 3 quick stanzas. Thor seized the hammer from his own lap. He stood up at the high table. The veil fell back. The bride's gown fell open. The keys jangled at his belt. The Brísingamen swung at his throat. Freyja's gold, and Thor's beard, and the great square iron head of Mjolnir all caught the firelight at the same moment, and Þrymr, beside him at the high seat, finally, too late, saw who his bride was. Þrymr stood up. Þrymr opened his mouth to call to his giants. Thor brought Mjolnir down. The Þrymskviða records the moment with the brief dignity of a poem that knows it does not need to elaborate. The hammer fell. Þrymr, the king of the Thursars, fell. The hall, for a single moment, was full of the small sound of the king of the Jոտnar of the eastern country striking the floor of his own hall. Then the giants began to rise, and Thor, the great red-bearded god, with the gown still half on, with the necklace still around his neck, with his hammer in his hand, Thor moved through the hall of Þrymr, the way Thor always moved through halls of giants. The poem does not give us the details. The poem says only that Thor, in this hall, killed every giant who stood up to come against him. The hall, by the time it was over, was silent. The wedding feast, by the time it was over, was no longer a wedding feast. Þrymr's hall was a hall of fallen giants and a god with a hammer. The Þrymskviða gives us one final small detail, and the detail is one of the strangest in the poem. At the end of the slaughter, when the hall was silent, an old Jotun woman came forward. She had been Þrymr's sister. She had, the poem implies, been at the wedding for the giving of the bride gift, which in the Old North was the gift of rings from the bridegroom's family to the bride. She had been about to give Freyja, as she imagined Freyja, the rings that were her right by custom. Now, with her brother dead, and the hall full of fallen giants, and the bride who was not a bride, standing in the middle of it all, with her hammer in her hand, she asked anyway. She asked for the rings. The Þrymskviða records, with a small dry note, that Thor gave her, instead, what he had given her brother. The hall went quiet. Thor lowered the hammer. He looked around the hall, at the long fallen tables, at the small fires still burning in the wall sconces, at the great half-eaten ox at the center of the high table, at the empty mead barrels on the floor, and he understood that the wedding was over. The mission was done. Mjolnir was in his hand. Loki, in his handmaiden's gown, stood very still in the corner of the hall. Loki, who had been the architect of the whole plan, who had been at Thor's side through the whole long impossible day, who had spoken for Thor at the feast and saved him from Þrymr's eyes and explained away the burning eyes and the great appetite. Loki, in this moment, did the one thing he was always good at, which was knowing when not to draw attention to himself. Loki said, "Are we going home?" Thor said, "Yes," and the two of them, the god of thunder, with his hammer in his hand, and his gown still half on, and the trickster of Asgard, with his handmaiden's cap askew on his head, and his small cold smile playing at the corner of his mouth, the two of them walked out of the hall of Þrymr in the deep blue light of the Jոտунheimr night, and they climbed back into the chariot of goats, and they turned the chariot west, and they went home. The Þrymskviða gives us one final stanza for the ride back. The chariot, with Thor no longer in the cosmic rage of the outward journey, with Mjolnir back in his hand and the matter resolved, drove west across the long country between Jոտунheimr and Asgard at the ordinary speed of a chariot. The road behind them did not catch fire. The mountains did not split. The earth did not burn. The two great goats pulled the chariot steadily across the cold country, through the night, and into the first gray light of the dawn over Asgard. Thor came home. Thor, still in the gown, the poem implies, because the poem does not record any pause to change clothes. Thor came home to the gods of Asgard, with Mjolnir at his side, in the first light of morning. The gods of Asgard, who had waited the night, came out to meet him. The Þrymskviða ends the story here, with one last small line. The gods received Thor. The hammer was back. The matter was closed. Freyja's necklace was returned to her. Freyja's gown was returned to her household. The bride's veil was folded carefully away. Loki's handmaiden's gown was folded away too. The chariot of goats was put back in its stable. The poem ends, as Eddic poems often end, with a small, simple note that the story is now over. Tonight, dear listener, the story will end in a slightly different way. Tonight, we will sit for a moment in the closing of the story before we let you go to sleep. Chapter 12, Goodnight, and the Wolf at the Edge of Time. The story we told you tonight is one of the strangest in the Old North. A god lost a hammer. The hammer was hidden 8 leagues underground by a king of the giants. The king of the giants demanded, as the price of the hammer's return, the goddess of love as his bride. The goddess refused. The gods of Asgard, having no other path, dressed the god of thunder in a bride's gown and a bride's veil, and sent him east to the giant's hall. The giant, in the small, awful pride of a being who has been waiting too long for his prize, failed to recognize that the bride was not the bride he had asked for. The hammer was brought out. The hammer was laid on the bride's knees. The bride, in that small moment, became again the god whose hammer it was. And the wedding ended in the way the wedding could only have ended. That is all. There is no great tragedy in this story. There is no death of a son of the gods. There is no binding of a great old enemy. There is no first meeting of 2 beings, fated to kill each other at the end of all things. There is only the small, precious comedy of a god in a bride's gown, and the small, precious moment in which his heart laughed inside his breast when his hand finally closed around the haft of his own hammer. But the Old North loved this story. The Old North loved this story the way the Old North loved any story in which the gods of Asgard, by some clever, impossible turn, recovered what they had lost. The Þrymskviða was one of the most beloved poems in the entire Eddic corpus. It survived in the Codex Regius. It was probably composed, the scholars believe, in the late 10th century or the early 11th, when the old religion of Iceland was just beginning to give way to the new religion. It was a poem from the late days of the Old North's understanding of itself. And it was, in some quiet way, exactly the kind of poem the Old Norse listeners needed. The hammer had been lost. The hammer had been recovered. The world had, by a strange, impossible path, been put right again. Thor was Thor again. Mjolnir was Mjolnir again. And the giants, the Old North believed, would not, for one more generation at least, be the masters of Asgard. But the giants were still there. The Þrymskviða does not say so in its closing stanza, but the Old North's listeners would have understood. Þrymr was one giant. Þrymr had hidden the hammer 8 leagues underground. Þrymr had been answered, but the giants of the eastern country were still there, in their long, cold halls, waiting. The giants would, in the next generation, try again. The giants would try again, and again, and again, through all the long stretching ages of the Old North's cosmos, until at last, at the end of all things, they would try one final time, and that final time would be the time when the gods of Asgard would not, by any clever, impossible plan, be able to send them home. That final time would be Ragnarok. The giants would come across the long road from the east. They would cross the Rainbow Bridge. They would walk into Asgard. The hammer would still be in Thor's hand. The hammer would, on that day, no longer be enough to send them back. The serpent we met 2 nights ago in the deep, cold sea would rise from the encircling water. Loki, who tonight, in the small, dignified comedy of the wedding feast, was Thor's clever, loyal companion. Loki would, by then, have become the great betrayer. Loki would lead the giants. Loki would ride at the head of the army. But Ragnarok is not yet. Ragnarok is, the Old North believed, still many generations away. Tonight the giants are at home in the cold east. The hammer is back at Thor's side. Freyja is back in her hall with her necklace at her throat. Loki is back in his small cold cunning, smiling his small smile, with no sign yet that the smile would, in some far future, turn into something terrible. Tonight is the small precious time before the ending. This is, in some quiet way, what the Þrymskviða was telling itself in the long winter halls of the late 10th century. The hammer is gone, the hammer is recovered, the world goes on, the giants are out there, the giants will try again, but for tonight, the giants are at home. For tonight, the hammer is here. For tonight, the gods of Asgard sit in Valhalla in the morning light, and Thor is taking off the bride's gown at last, and Loki is taking off the handmaiden's cap, and Freyja is fastening the Brísingamen back around her own throat, and the long quiet day after the strange impossible night is beginning. That is what tonight's story is, a small, precious recovery, a hammer back in its place, a few thousand more years of the world. We will tell you, next time, of a god who went into the country of the giants for a different reason, not to recover something stolen, but to seek something he wanted, of a hall of riddles, of a contest of strength, of a great horn that no being could drain, of a cat that no being could lift, of an old crone called Ellie, whose name in the old language meant simply old age, and against whom even Thor could not stand. We will tell you of the visit to Utgarda Loki on Wednesday. But for now, the bride is no longer the bride. The hammer is back in its place beside Thor's bed. The chariot of goats is stabled. The Brísingamen catches the morning light at Freyja's throat. Loki is sitting again at his own table with his warm cup in his hands, watching the dawn come on, the small cold smile playing at the corner of his mouth. Sif is in the kitchen of her hall, with her gold hair shining in the morning light, making breakfast for her husband who has come home. Thor is sitting on the edge of his bed, taking off the last of the bride's gown and reaching down to the place beside the bed where Mjolnir now is again. The world has another few thousand years. The wolf at the edge of time waits. The great ship Naglfar is still being built. Ragnarok is still far away. Tonight there is only the cold morning of Asgard, and a hammer back in its place, and a god in his own bed, and a small smile somewhere across town that is not yet turned into the smile that ends everything. Good night, dear listener, wherever you are tonight, whatever bed you are in, whatever quiet room, whatever soft pillow you have laid your head on. Let the picture of the god and the hammer be the last picture you carry into sleep, not the slaughter at the end of the wedding feast, not the falling of Þrymr, the hand of the god, hidden under the embroidered sleeve of the bride's gown, closing around the haft of his own hammer for the first time in 8 long nights, the small private laughter of his heart inside his breast, the recognition, the recovery. Let the wolf at the edge of time wait. Let the great ship Naglfar wait in the cold east. Let Ragnarok wait. Tonight there is only the morning, and the hammer, and the good night. And tonight there is only your bed, and your breath, and the room around you growing dark. Sleep. The sleeping Almanac will be here on Wednesday with another story from the Old North. New episodes every Wednesday and Sunday at 8 o'clock in the evening. If the story carried you down into sleep, If the picture of the god and the hammer was the last thing you saw before the dark came, leave a quiet small note in the comments. We read everyone. We tell each other in the morning who slept. Sleep deeply, sleep without dreams, and wake into a quieter world. Good night, dear listener, from the long old north, from the bride who was not a bride, from the hammer back in its place, from the almanac that is keeping the slow count. Good night.